The morning they changed the locks, I was still wearing the black dress from my father's funeral. It was 11 days after we buried him. 11 days since I'd stood at the graveside and watched my brother Marcus drape his arm around my mother like he was already the man of the house, already the one in charge, already the one who mattered. I remember thinking, even then, even through the grief, that something was wrong. Not in the way grief makes everything feel wrong, in a different way. In the way your gut sends a signal your brain doesn't want to receive. I ignored it. I went home that night and cried myself to sleep like I'd done every night since Dad's heart gave out. I thought the worst was already behind us. I was wrong. My name is Diane Calloway. And on a cold Tuesday morning in February, I drove up to the house I had grown up in, the house my father built with his own hands, the house where I'd learned to ride a bike on the driveway and burned my first batch of Christmas cookies and had my wedding photos taken on the back porch. And I found a locksmith finishing up on the front door. I asked him who'd called him. He handed me a work order. The name at the top was Marcus Calloway, my brother. I knocked. I rang the bell. Marcus opened the door with a look on his face I had never seen before. Not guilt, not embarrassment, something colder than both of those. He told me the house was part of the estate now, and that his attorney had advised him that until probate was settled, no one should be coming and going without authorization. I told him I was his sister. He told me he knew that. Then he closed the door. What happened over the next 18 months would destroy everything I thought I knew about my family, about my father, about loyalty, and about justice, and then it would rebuild something better in its place. Something my father had planned for a very long time. My father, Gerald Calloway, was not a flashy man. He wore the same brand of boots for 30 years. He drove a truck with a dent in the rear panel that he never got around to fixing. He called himself a builder of things, because that was what he actually did. He started Calloway Construction in 1981 with a $4,000 loan from his father-in-law, a pickup truck, and a willingness to work 16-hour days. By the time I was born, it was a regional outfit doing residential projects across 3 counties. By the time I turned 12, they were breaking ground on commercial developments. By the time I graduated college, Calloway Construction had contracts with the state and an office building with our name on it. He was proud of what he'd built. He just wasn't loud about it. That was my father's way. He showed you he loved you by teaching you things. He showed you he respected you by asking your opinion. And he showed you he trusted you by making you part of things quietly, without ceremony, without the announcement you might have expected. Marcus was 4 years older than me. He was the kind of person who filled a room, tall, handsome in a polished way, with the easy confidence of someone who had always been told he was exceptional. Our mother adored him. She always had. From the time he was a child, Marcus was the future in our family's story, the one who would carry the name forward. The golden one. I was not the golden one. I was the quiet one. The one who sat in the corner at family gatherings and listened. The one who helped Dad in his study on weekends, going through contracts, asking questions, learning the business not because I was told to, but because I genuinely loved it. Dad used to say I had the mind for it. He said it privately, to me, never in front of Marcus or our mother. I understood why. There was a hierarchy in our family that was unspoken but absolute. And disturbing it would have cost more than it was worth. I married at 28, moved 40 minutes away, raised 2 kids, worked part-time in real estate, and stayed close to my father. We had a ritual. Every Saturday morning, I would drive over, and he and I would have coffee and talk. Not about the family, about the business, about what was working and what wasn't, about the economy and the housing market and the cost of materials. I thought of it as just time with my dad. I didn't understand then that he was teaching me something, preparing me for something. Marcus joined the company officially when he was 32. Dad gave him a title, Vice President of Operations, and a corner office and the kind of introduction at industry dinners that made Marcus glow for weeks. He did work hard, I'll give him that. He was good at the front-facing things. The handshakes, the pitches, the ribbon cuttings. He expanded the company's marketing, brought in a slicker logo, pushed into new markets. Dad let him lead. But I noticed on my Saturday morning visits that Dad never talked about Marcus the way he talked about the company itself. He talked around him, carefully, the way you talk around something fragile. When Dad's heart started giving him trouble about 5 years before his death, he slowed down. He came into the office less. He started spending more time with his estate attorney, a man named Richard Howell, whom I had met exactly once at a company Christmas party years earlier. He never mentioned these meetings to anyone. Not to Marcus, not to my mother, and not, at the time, to me. 3 years before Dad died, something shifted in Marcus. He'd always been ambitious. But there's ambitious in the way a person works hard to build something. And there's ambitious in the way a person starts looking at what already exists and calculating how to claim it. Marcus started attending Dad's doctor's appointments, started taking calls in the hallway at family dinners, started asking questions about the estate in that careful, casual way that pretends it isn't a question at all. I noticed. I didn't say anything. I didn't have the language for what I was noticing. And then Dad died. And everything I hadn't named came rushing into the open. The weeks after the funeral were a masterclass in how grief can be weaponized. Marcus moved fast. He called a family meeting, just him, my mother, and 2 of my mother's sisters, who had always considered themselves stakeholders in our family's finances despite having contributed nothing to any of it. I was not invited. I found out about the meeting from a cousin who texted me afterward, confused by what she'd heard. In that meeting, Marcus presented his version of the family's future. He had already spoken to a business attorney, not Richard Howell, Dad's attorney, but someone Marcus had chosen himself, and had produced documents suggesting that under the existing corporate structure, he was the natural successor to Dad's operational role. He said the company would need strong leadership during the transition. He said he was prepared to provide it. He said that my role, which had never been a formal one, didn't need to be formalized now. I wasn't there to respond. That, of course, was the point. Over the following weeks, I was quietly and systematically excluded. Emails I should have been copied on went without my name. A board meeting that had been scheduled, the first since Dad's passing, was held on a Wednesday afternoon when Marcus knew I had a commitment I couldn't break. When I asked for the minutes afterward, I was told they were still being drafted. They were never sent to me. My mother, to her lasting shame, said almost nothing. She was grieving, yes. But she also had always followed Marcus's lead when it came to anything that required a decision, and she was following it now. She told me during one of our stilted phone calls in that period that Marcus was doing what needed to be done. I asked her if she thought I deserved a seat at the table. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "Diane, you've never really been involved in the business." I didn't respond to that. There was no response that wouldn't have made things worse. The locksmith was the final punctuation on a sentence Marcus had been writing for months. After he closed that door in my face, I sat in my car for 45 minutes. Then I drove home and called Richard Howell. I had not spoken to Richard since my father's death. I had sent a note, a handwritten card, the way my father had taught me to do for people who mattered. Richard had called me the following week, left a message on my phone, and said simply that when I was ready, there were some things we should discuss at my convenience. I hadn't called back. I wasn't ready. Now I was. We met in his office 3 days later. It was a quiet office, the kind that smells like old paper and careful thinking, with diplomas on the wall and a window that looked out onto a parking lot. Richard was in his late 60s, a compact man with reading glasses he wore pushed up on his forehead. He had a folder on the desk when I arrived. He offered me tea. I declined. He sat down, opened the folder, and looked at me over the top of his glasses. "Your father," he said, "was a very deliberate man." He slid the first document across the desk. What I read in that office over the next 2 hours changed everything. 12 years before he died, my father had created a revocable trust. Not unusual. Many business owners do this for estate planning purposes. But the specifics of my father's trust were anything but ordinary. Over the course of a decade, quietly, methodically, with the kind of patience that only someone who truly understands how time works can sustain. He had transferred ownership of shares in Calloway Construction into this trust. Not all at once, a little at a time. Each transfer was legal, properly documented, filed correctly, each one small enough not to draw attention, each one part of a plan he had never shared with anyone except Richard Howell. The trust was irrevocable at the time of his death. The beneficiary was me. My father had left me 51% of Calloway Construction. Not Marcus. Not my mother. Not a committee. Me. His quiet daughter who had sat with him on Saturday mornings and learned the difference between a load-bearing wall and a partition, and why material costs were always the first thing to watch when margins tightened. Me, who had never held a title in the company. Me, who Marcus had told the board didn't need to be formalized into anything. I sat with that for a long moment. Richard waited. He was very good at waiting. "There's more," he said. He slid a second document across. This one was a letter. My father's handwriting, the careful, blocky print he used when he wanted something to be clear and unmistakable. It was addressed to me. In it, he explained everything. He had watched Marcus for years. He had seen, earlier than anyone, the shift from ambition to acquisition. He had never confronted Marcus about it because confrontation wasn't how Dad solved problems. Instead, he planned. He told me in that letter that he had always believed I was the one who truly understood what the company was for. Not what it was worth, but what it was for. He said the company was his life's work and he needed it in the hands of someone who understood that a business is not just an asset to be liquidated when it becomes convenient. He said he was sorry for the years of being quiet about how much he saw in me, because he knew the quiet had sometimes felt like indifference. It did not feel like indifference anymore. He also told me in the letter that he had made a second trust. A personal estate trust, separate from the business. This one covered the family home, a portfolio of rental properties, and a set of investment accounts. The total value, at the time of his death, had been estimated by Richard's team at just under $18 million. The beneficiary of that trust was also me, with a provision that my mother would receive a monthly income for her lifetime from the interest. Marcus was provided for, a lump sum, clearly stated, generous by any reasonable measure. But the assets, the real assets, the compounding generational wealth, the properties and the portfolios and the control, those were mine. My father had known what Marcus would do the moment he was gone. He had simply made sure it didn't matter. I did not call Marcus that night. I did not call my mother. I drove home, sat with my husband at the kitchen table, and told him everything. He was very still the whole time I talked. When I finished, he asked me one question. "What do you want to do?" I thought about it for a long time. "I want to do it right," I said, "and I want to do it by the book." Richard filed the necessary paperwork over the following 3 weeks. We were methodical. Every document was in order. Every transfer was verified. Every crossing of every legal T happened exactly as it needed to. When I was ready, when everything was properly in place and nothing could be challenged, Richard's office sent formal notice to the company's board of directors. I want you to understand what this meant. The board of Calloway Construction had been operating under the assumption, for more than 4 months, that Marcus was the de facto heir to my father's position. He hadn't been given a formal title yet, but he had been making decisions, conducting meetings, and presenting himself in every substantive way as the man in charge. The board had gone along with it because Marcus is persuasive and because no one had given them any reason not to. The notice from Richard's office was their reason. It stated clearly that the majority controlling interest in Calloway Construction, 51% of outstanding shares, had transferred to me, Diane Calloway, via irrevocable trust upon the death of Gerald Calloway. It further stated that as majority shareholder, I was requesting a formal board meeting within 10 business days, and that all pending decisions regarding executive succession were to be considered suspended pending that meeting. I was told later, by one of the board members who became an ally, that Marcus had gone white when the notice was read aloud. Then he had gone very quiet. The quiet was worse, apparently, than the initial reaction. I arrived at that board meeting in a navy suit my father had once told me made me look like I meant business. I was 15 minutes early. I sat at the head of the table, my right as majority shareholder, and I waited. Marcus arrived last. He looked at me across the length of that conference room, and something moved across his face that I had never seen there before. I think it was fear. Not the fear of being caught doing something wrong. Exactly. The deeper fear of having miscalculated, of having misread the entire situation, of having moved all his pieces to the center of the board and discovered, too late, that the game had already been decided. Richard presented the trust documents in full. A second attorney, the company's own outside counsel, verified each document independently. The board members asked their questions. Richard answered all of them. At one point, Marcus's attorney, a different man from the one he'd brought in right after Dad died, this one younger and clearly less comfortable, tried to raise a procedural objection. Richard addressed it calmly, completely, and without visible irritation. The objection evaporated. Marcus didn't speak during the formal portion of the meeting. At the end, when Richard had concluded and the board had acknowledged the transfer of control, there was a moment of silence around that table. And then Marcus looked at me, and I looked at him, and I said very quietly, "I think that's everything for today. We'll schedule a follow-up to discuss the management transition." That was the whole conversation. On the way out, Marcus stopped in the doorway. He said my name. I turned. He said, "Did you know? Before he died, did you know?" The question surprised me. I told him the truth. I had not known. Dad had not told me. He had trusted me not because I'd asked for it, but because he'd watched me for decades and made his own judgment. Marcus nodded slowly. Then he walked out. The months after that meeting were not simple, and I will not pretend they were. Taking over a company your father built, especially when the family politics around it have become as tangled as ours had, is not a clean or painless process. Marcus contested the trust. It took 7 months and 3 separate legal proceedings before every challenge was dismissed. During that time, I ran the company. I showed up every day. I made decisions. I had conversations with contractors and project managers and site supervisors, and I discovered in those conversations that many of them had worked with my father for decades and were quietly, privately relieved that someone who reminded them of him was now at the helm. My mother, for her part, took a very long time to come around. She had believed, I think sincerely, that Marcus was the right choice. Not out of any malice toward me, but out of a worldview she had held so long that she'd never examined it. The son carried things forward. That was how it worked. When she was forced to confront that my father had held a different view, and had held it so deeply that he'd spent 12 years encoding it into legal documents, it required her to reconsider a lot of things. That process was painful for both of us. We are still in it, but we are in it together, which is more than I expected. My relationship with Marcus is different, formal now. We communicate through attorneys when there are contested matters and through brief, civil exchanges at family events. He is no longer involved with the company. He accepted a buyout that, by any objective measure, left him financially comfortable for the rest of his life, and I'd like to believe that some quiet part of him recognizes that my father's provision for him was generous. Whether he recognizes it or not is something I can't control. What I could control, what I can control, is the company. And that's where I put my energy. In the 2 years since the trust activated, Calloway Construction has expanded into 2 new markets. We've taken on a workforce development initiative that hires from underserved communities in the county, something my father talked about in the last years of his life but never got to implement. We broke ground, 4 months ago, on a mixed-use development that will be the largest project in the company's history. At the groundbreaking ceremony, I stood at the podium in front of the team and the press and a few city officials, and I thought about my father standing at a podium 30 years ago with a shovel in his hand and a company that was just beginning to be what it would become. I thought about Saturday mornings and coffee and the way he taught me to read a contract and ask the right questions. I thought about the letter in Richard's folder, in his careful blocky handwriting, telling me he was sorry for staying quiet so long. I have his desk now. The one from his office, the heavy oak one he brought from home when the company first got big enough to need a real office. I had it moved to my office when I took over. Some people thought it was sentimental. Maybe it is. But when I sit behind it, I feel what I imagine he meant me to feel. That the work is serious, and it is worth doing seriously, and that the people who will be affected by it deserve the same patience and care that built the thing in the first place. The locks on my childhood home have been changed again. By me this time, with my mother's blessing. The house is a family property now, held in trust for the next generation, which is what my father always intended it to be. Marcus was not excluded from that arrangement. Dad didn't raise us to be cruel to each other, and I'm not going to start.